In his letter to Nimitz, Halsey went into great detail about the damage done to the Big E and the others. He was showing the stuff of wartime command, precision of detail, aggressiveness, leadership of the men. If we get away with it, and I fully believe we shall, I think a splendid job has been done under the conditions pertaining here. Halsey was firing things up. They canted the South Dakota and repaired her at Noumea. One of her turrets was not very strong, but he was not going to complain. She was ready to fight again. The San Diego developed a bulge in one gun, but instead of sending her back to Pearl, Halsey's men found a spare 5-inch gun and set about making the change themselves. More guns, that was what Halsey wanted. I am having prepared a list of our minimum requirements of destroyers. Supported by the reasons, therefore, I will forward this to you by dispatch. You probably will not be able to meet it, but do the best you can and bring all the pressure to bear possible. Escort and more escort vessels are a crying need. That is where the shoe pinches. Halsey was also feeling the pinches of command. Rear Admiral H. Good, who had been commanding Task Force 17, fell sick with the flu and had to be evacuated to Australia. Halsey wanted to fleet up Captain McMorris, but Nimitz had other ideas. McMorris was slated for a task force in the Aleutians, so Admiral Dan Callahan was sent out with a task force. He was delighted to get into things, and with his good Irish name and splendid character, I feel sure he will make good. Every time Halsey sent something or someone to Australia, Nimitz was concerned lest MacArthur swallow it or him up. But Halsey was not letting go. He kept tight control of Christie's submarines and of some B-24S he sent to Australia at General Harmon's request. Halsey could be critical of methods and at the same time supremely generous about people. He was upset about the Air Corps' bad bombing record. At Santa Cruz, the B-17S dropped 88 bombs and secured 2 hits on a destroyer. He talked to Harmon about it and kept asking that the bombers be brought down. But as for Harmon, I do not understand why he has not been given 3 stars commensurate with the important command he is holding. I would be delighted if anything could be done to get the additional star for him. He groused about the Bureau of Personnel. He had wanted a specific officer who was an ROTC instructor at the University of North Carolina and had been turned down. I wish someone would tell some of the people in Washington that we have a little war on our hands out here, he complained, and immediately he was contrite. As you may rightly interpret, my growls and grouches are the privilege of an old sailorman. As ever, cheerfully yours. That was Admiral Bill Halsey, November 1942. Nimitz was very pleased with Halsey, and so was King. Secretary Knox had not been so sure of Halsey's abilities in overall command as had Nimitz, but he was convinced by this time. It was fortunate that this confidence was established before the second week in November, for with the middle of the month coming up, the Japanese were again ready to launch an effort to recapture Guadalcanal. Admiral Yamamoto was a very determined man. The Americans brought in 155 artillery pieces, and the Japanese brought in 1,500 new troops to Coley Point, where they were hard hit by ship bombardment and the Marines. But the Japanese kept coming down the slot, and in 8 days brought 67 shiploads of troops to western Guadalcanal. On November 9th, Nimitz predicted a major enemy attempt to capture Guadalcanal, with the 13th as the target date. He had a new task force, 61, ready to sail for Noumea, and it was on 1-hour notice for departure. At Noumea, Halsey returned from an inspection trip that day to find an anxious Captain Miles Browning waiting for him. Browning's thin face screwed up as if he had bad news. He did. The Japanese were coming in with great force to reinforce the island of Guadalcanal, the force including 2 carriers, 4 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, some light cruisers, and 36 destroyers. That was Halsey's initial information. To oppose this force he had Norman Scott's force, a light cruiser and 4 destroyers, Turner with a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, Callahan with 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 6 destroyers, Kincaid with the Enterprise, which was still under repair at Noumea, a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, and several destroyers. Then there was a force of 2 battleships and a pair of destroyers under Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, which were actually part of the Enterprise force. One trouble, however, was that these forces were all over the lot. Scott was at Espiritu Santo on November 9th. Turner was at sea, en route from Noumea to Lunga Point, escorting several transports. Callahan was at sea. On November 10th, Turner, who was in charge of tactical operations, wrote Callahan a letter. "It looks this time like the enemy is finally about to make an all-out effort against Cactus," he said. "Whether we will be there in time or not, I can't say. I do wish we were a day earlier, but that was impossible. In any case, I fear we can't turn back this time and still have the chance to go in later." Turner discussed the enemy strength and then closed. "In any case, you have under your own control your own tactical operations. If we can really strike the enemy hard, it will be more important for you to do that than to protect my transports. Good luck to you, Dan. God bless all of you and give you strength." On November 12th, while unloading at Guadalcanal, Turner's force was attacked from the air, but drove off the Japanese. On the night of November 12th, Callahan led his ships and those of Scott, his junior, into Iron Bottom Sound, and early on the morning of Friday the 13th, Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe led a raiding group of 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and 14 destroyers to bombard the Americans ashore at Guadalcanal. The 2 forces met. Almost at the opening of the action, Admiral Scott and most of the others on his bridge were killed by a shell that struck there. In a few moments the ship, the Atlanta, was dead in the water. Next down was the destroyer Cushing, which had just fired 6 torpedoes at the battleship Hiei. But the torpedoes missed. Laffey came up and fired torpedoes too soon, which bounced off the battleship's sides without exploding. She was hit at point-blank range and destroyed. Destroyer Sterett was hit but kept fighting. Admiral Callahan and most on the bridge of the San Francisco were killed by a shell from the battleship Kirishima. Portland was hit by a torpedo. The Juno took a torpedo. The Barton was sunk by a torpedo. On the Japanese side, the destroyer Udachi was sunk, so was Akatsuki, and the destroyers Ikazuchi, Murasame, and Amatsukaze were hit. The big battleship Hiei was also badly hit, and her rudder destroyed. Next day, Atlanta sank, and Juno blew up when she was torpedoed again, this time by a Japanese submarine. That was the end of the first phase of the battle, the Japanese having dealt out tremendous punishment, but having failed to achieve their objective, the bombardment of Guadalcanal. Next day, bombers sank Hii, which helped even the score. And then Halsey ordered out Admiral Lee with the battleships and Admiral Kinkaid to protect the hurt American vessels. The orders to Kinkaid and Lee came late, Morrison later said very late, and another Japanese bombardment group came into the Sound and hit Henderson Field before Kinkaid could arrive. The Japanese seemed to be in control, and their transports were moving in. But in the morning of November 14th, Henderson Field was still operational. 17 fighter planes and 1 bomber had been destroyed, but there were still planes to fly. Northwest of Guadalcanal, the planes found the Japanese 2nd Bombardment Force and attacked. They started fires on the heavy cruiser Kinugasa and the light cruiser Isuzu. Later, planes from Enterprise found the force and sank Kinugasa. They damaged heavy cruisers Chokai and Maya and the destroyer Michishio. Meanwhile, the Japanese transports were heading for Guadalcanal. They were attacked repeatedly by planes from Enterprise and Henderson Field, holing some and sinking one. All morning and afternoon the fighting went on, and 7 transports were sunk but 4 remained, escorted by 11 destroyers, and they were steaming straight for Guadalcanal. South of Savo Island, Admiral Lee came up with his 6-ship column, 4 destroyers, and the battleships Washington and South Dakota. The Japanese had reformed and were coming in, the Tokyo Express in spades, with one section that included a light cruiser and 3 destroyers, a screen section of a light cruiser and 6 destroyers, and the big group with the heavy cruisers Atako and Takao and the battleship Kirishima. They spotted the Americans and moved to attack in 4 different sections. The destroyers Walkie, Gwyn and Benham were hit. Preston was put out of action. In a very short time all were out of action. Walker was sinking, Preston was abandoned, Gwynn and Benham were limping away. They had accomplished very little. South Dakota was plagued by power failures and fires, and came under the guns of 3 heavy Japanese ships. But Admiral Lee then found the enemy, and Washington began to open up. In a few minutes she lobbed 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima, plus about 45-inch projectiles, and that battleship was out of the fight, blazing furiously. Soon Otago and Takao were hit by both American battleships, and they retired. Kirishima sank before dawn. The Japanese did succeed in landing their 4 transports, beaching them, and putting another 2,000 soldiers ashore. They had dealt out fearful damage, especially with their torpedoes, but they had not succeeded in really reinforcing their garrison, while Admiral Turner had put all his men and materiel ashore. In terms of the fleet, the Japanese had inflicted great damage, but the object was to win the war, and in this instance to win and maintain control of the island of Guadalcanal. The Japanese had lost control, and they would not regain it again. 3 months after landing in the Solomons, 3 very shaky months, the Americans had seized the initiative in the Pacific War. The Japanese had sunk 3 light cruisers and 7 destroyers. The Americans had sunk 2 Japanese battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers. From Washington and Pearl Harbor came messages of congratulation to Halsey, and he passed the accolade along to the troops. "Your names have been written in golden letters upon the pages of history, and you have won the everlasting gratitude of our countrymen." On November 15th, General Vandergrift could write Nimitz gleefully of sitting on an observation hill and watching planes drop bombs on 4 Japanese transports, which went up in flames. It was indeed a glorious sight. He could also see the future. Things have happened very rapidly. We have not only been able to hold on to what we had, but pushed out some 3½ to 4 miles to the west and an equal distance to the east. Our offensive to the west was gaining ground slowly through a jungle literally infested with these Japanese, when certain news that we received caused us to halt the advance in order to be prepared to repel boarders. Today we are fortunate that this whole push has been neutralized. Vandergrift was so moved that he sent a dispatch to Turner, praising the Navy, lamenting the loss of Scott and Callahan, and referring to the hopeless odds they had faced. Turner, to be known in naval history as Terrible Turner, thanked Vandergrift, but called him down for using the term. The phrase is emphatic, but all of us, and most of you, refuse to believe that the odds are hopeless. There was time now for such little irritations, time to pick up the pieces of the battle, and that was the job of the commanders. Halsey was not pretending false modesty when he told the men of his command that the victory was theirs, not his. "I accept them in all humility for myself, and as representing the splendid body of fighting men who did the actual job," he wrote Nimitz. And when he was promoted to full admiral for having supervised the victory, Halsey sent his old 3-star pins to the widows of Scott and Callahan, with the messages that their husbands' bravery had won him the new stars. Then it was back to business, for there were decisions to be made and plans for the future. One of the decisions was a sad one, to relieve the captain of the cruiser Helena for dereliction of duty. On November 14th, Captain Gilbert Hoover was steaming southeast down Indispensable Strait after the action with the Japanese. He was senior officer present, following the death of Admiral Callahan in the San Francisco, and so was in charge of a flotilla that included 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers. Suddenly the Juno exploded. Captain Hoover saw a B-17 overhead and notified the plane, asking that the message be transmitted to Halsey's headquarters. Then he moved on out with his 4 remaining ships, not stopping to help possible survivors. As it turned out, there were 120 survivors, and the B-17's message never got through to Halsey. Of the men of the Juno, only 10 were finally saved. At Noumea, Captain Hoover told his story to Halsey, Admiral Fitch, Admiral Turner, and Admiral Calhoun, commander of the service force. The latter 3 recommended the relief, and Halsey sent Hoover back to Pearl Harbor. Later, however, He regretted this action and tried to make amends by recommending Hoover's restoration to combat command. With the lull that followed the Battle of Guadalcanal, Halsey began planning. He moved his headquarters from the Argonne to a house ashore in Noumea, the Japanese consul's house. There he revelled in using the enemy's silverware and china, and when his Filipino houseboy broke the china, he had no complaint. The hell with it, it's Japanese. He complained because the furniture was so short they had to sit on the back of our necks, but the brick house, high atop a hill overlooking the harbour, was very comfortable. He commandeered another house and built 2 Quonset huts for the staff. Halsey took advantage of the confusion of the enemy to better his logistics. Gasoline storage tanks were brought into Guadalcanal, thus ending the perennial aviation gas problem. Turkeys were brought in for Thanksgiving dinner, and other luxuries began to appear on the island. The first part of the Solomons campaign was over, Halsey said on November 29th, and at that point he began thinking of the next move. A tempting thought we have toyed with is to bypass everything up the line and hit directly at Rabaul. I believe with Rabaul in our hands the war in the Pacific is approaching an end. If the view seemed overly optimistic, at least Halsey was showing a spirit that had not existed 6 weeks earlier in the South Pacific, and he was laying the groundwork for the island-passing campaign. The idea was so logical that it has been claimed for Forrest Sherman, Admiral Towers, MacArthur, and for Halsey. Whoever might have said the first word about bypassing certain Japanese strongholds, the idea soon gained momentum and was most thoroughly discussed among the Navy men. The attitude of the fighting force was entirely changed. "Everyone here is working like a beaver," Halsey wrote Nimitz, "and we have received a tremendous uplift from the confidence that you have shown in us." Opportunity presented itself very quickly, but the American force was not quite ready for it. Halsey was very proud of Admiral Lee's showing with the battleships at the Battle of Guadalcanal. It proved to him that the day of the big capital ship was far from past. "How are all the experts going to comment now?" he asked. "The use we made of them defied all conventions, narrow waters, submarine menace, and destroyers at night. Despite that, the books and the learned and ponderous words of the highbrows, it worked." A few days later, the general approach would be tried again, with different results. Admiral Kinkaid was ordered by Halsey to take command of the cruiser force at Espiritu Santo. The force included the cruisers Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton, and Honolulu, plus 4 destroyers. But those orders were countermanded by Admiral King, who had decided that Kinkaid was to take command of the North Pacific Force. Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright of the class of 1912 succeeded Kinkaid to the cruiser command. On the night of November 29th, Halsey discovered that the Japanese were not finished, but were sending down a force of 8 destroyers and 6 transports to reinforce Guadalcanal. Wright was ordered to intercept. He set out at 28 knots for the trip of nearly 600 miles to Guadalcanal. On the way, he picked up 2 more destroyers. Actually, the Japanese force consisted of only 8 destroyers, with several loaded as transports, with drums of supplies that would be shoved off into the shallow water. There, small Japanese boats would come out and get them. On the evening of November 30th, the Americans came in to intercept. The Japanese were already moving along the shoreline of Guadalcanal. The Americans caught the Japanese by surprise. The American destroyers launched torpedoes, and the American cruisers opened up on the enemy ships. The torpedoes missed. They were fired too late. The gunfire destroyed the destroyer Takanami, but the other Japanese destroyers struck back. 2 Japanese torpedoes hit Minneapolis. New Orleans took a torpedo that knocked off the bow of the ship back to Numpel 2 turret. Pensacola was hit and set afire. Northampton took 2 torpedoes and went to the bottom before morning, although 773 men were rescued and only 58 crewmen were drowned or killed in action. More than a week later, Halsey still did not know how many Japanese ships had been sunk or how the action had ended. He did know, however, that Northampton was gone and 3 other cruisers were damaged. Pensacola was least hurt, and he hoped to repair her at Tulagi. New Orleans had her bow cut off, but was being shored up so she might be moved. Minneapolis was in the worst shape. Her bow had been blown off, but was still attached to the hull, and had to be cut loose before anything else could be done. Soon all three were sent to Australia for repair. Admiral Wright's action report must have been dismal to prepare. He took full responsibility for the delay of his destroyers in moving into action, although the senior destroyer commander might have taken some of it. Nimitz was very understanding. He felt that Wright had been unlucky to take command just before a battle, and be forced, as he was, to use another admiral's battle plan. Poor Wright was returned to Pearl Harbor, and there Nimitz had the unfortunate duty to inform him that he would be sent back to the Navy Department on the orders of Admiral King. Reading between the lines of your postscript in your December 11th letter, Nimitz wrote Halsey, "I judge that this will be satisfactory to you. In this connection, please be utterly frank with me regarding flag officers. We are out to win a war and not to please individuals. Those not in line for the first team must be sent ashore. It was a hard war, with no place for sentimentality. Fond as Nimitz was of his favourite admiral, he would have relieved Halsey too had he not done the job that was necessary. There was, however, no need to consider such a course. On December 9th, the 1st Marines were relieved and sent to Australia. The Japanese never again mounted a major attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal. 2 months after Halsey's arrival on the South Pacific scene, the battle was won. December 7th, 1942, February 8th, 1943. On the first anniversary of the Pacific War, Admiral Nimitz could look at his command with a certain amount of satisfaction. As a result of the last 2 sea and air battles, costly as they were, the Americans controlled the sea and air in the southern Solomons, and Guadalcanal and Tulagi were safe. Task 1 of the broad directive for the campaign had, by and large, been accomplished. Task 2 called for the seizure and occupation of the rest of the Solomons, Lai, Salamaua, and the north coast of New Guinea. Task 3 called for expulsion of the Japanese from the Bismarck archipelago, but these tasks were to be changed. Task 2 would now be to capture and occupy the remainder of the Solomons and hold New Guinea. Nimitz's area was to be extended to the equator at 145 degrees east, then to the centre of Vitiaz Strait, to Woodlark Island, Rossel Island, and then south. In November, King had suggested that Halsey and Nimitz threatened to bog down in the Solomons, when perhaps they would best cut off the Japanese by seizing the base from which the Solomons were supplied. On December 8th, Nimitz wrote King a long letter suggesting that there would be considerable delay. The reason was to allow for build-up of American land and sea forces in the South Pacific. Sea forces could not be expected to be superior to the Japanese until the spring of 1943. Air equality had been achieved, more planes could be diverted to the area quickly, but more bases were needed, and this would take some time. As for troops, who must take and hold territory, the 1st Marine Division would need until March to recuperate. The 2nd Marine Division could be ready in February, and the 3rd Marine Division in March. No Army divisions were yet in training, and it would take 3 months to train them for amphibious operations. Taking a hard look at Japanese and American capabilities, Nimitz offered this summation. The Jap is our equal in his willingness to fight. Surface units must be considered of equal ability, except that our fire control radar seems to give us a considerable advantage in low visibility, and our AA batteries are superior. We have no evidence for comparison in day surface action. Our air forces are definitely superior in quality. US land forces in the Solomons have proved themselves better armed and more skillful than the Japanese, but we could hardly expect a continuation of the disproportionate personnel losses we have been able to inflict, and must realize that we will still require a superiority in numbers at our point of attack. Our submarines have proved themselves to be more effective units than those of the Japanese. Our great inferiority is in the use and performance of torpedoes. Nimitz here considered the bypass idea, even to the point of making Rabaul the first objective. It was a strong temptation, he said, but he inclined toward conservatism because the system of bases the Japanese held outside New Guinea was mutually supporting, and the communication line of any base seized would be flanked by the enemy bases bypassed. To bypass, he thought, would require a strength that was not in sight for the near future. At that moment he was considering taking Buin, 300 miles from Guadalcanal, or Munda, New Georgia, 180 miles from Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were starting to build an airfield. What was necessary, vital, was to build up strength, always planning 2 moves ahead, so there would be no future delays like the one they were suffering at the end of 1942. Armed with this summary, Nimitz left Pearl Harbor on December 8th for San Francisco to confer with King again. Admiral Kinkaid was also there, for the North Pacific force that he would command was about to go into action against the Japanese. Theobald, who had been in charge in the Alaskan area, would go to Boston to command the 1st Naval District, for Wilson Brown was then to become President Roosevelt's naval aide. They talked to personnel for a time. The Navy needed 30 more flag officers to handle the ships that were coming off the ways, and Nimitz supplied a list. He also plumped for the appointment of Aubrey Fitch as a vice-admiral, but King felt there were too many vice-admirals at the moment, and no decision was made. Nimitz also tried to soften the blow for Admiral Wright by keeping him on the staff, but King felt that bringing in another admiral would overload the Nimitz staff with flag officers, and Nimitz had to agree with him. On the first day, King, Nimitz, Rear Admiral Cook, Kinkaid, Captain McCormick and Captain Fechteler were in the room, as they talked about the Aleutians operation and set a target date for the invasion of Kiska as March 1st. For several months, King and Nimitz had been bedeviled by difficulties in the intelligence establishment. It had been decided to establish a Pacific Ocean Intelligence Center in Honolulu. The idea was originally germinated in the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, which envisioned a center of 500 people or more. This center would swallow up the old Radio Intelligence Unit, which had been operating in Hawaii, meaning particularly that Commander Rochefort's operations would come under the new center. Apparently Rochefort had resisted being swallowed up by the new organization, and in the fall of 1942 he had summarily been transferred back to Washington without Nimitz's knowledge. Theoretically, of course, there was no need for ONI or anyone else to inform Nimitz of the Rochefort transfer, but in practice Rochefort had been responsible for the intelligence that set up the Midway victory, and Nimitz was distressed when he learned the facts. He admired Rochefort's useful work and had recommended Rochefort for a Distinguished Service Medal after Midway. Nimitz stepped into a hornet's nest. He objected in writing to Admiral Train, director of ONI, and to Admiral Horn of the Bureau of Personnel, and finally to King. I have no information other than that you have furnished of bickerings and jealousy between the Washington and Pearl Harbor RI, Radio Intelligence Units, but I observed enough out here to know that Rochefort's sin was probably one of doing too much rather than too little, a hard thing for which to condemn a man. Nimitz's worry was that the naval intelligence people were trying to build a bureaucracy. He did not want such a huge intelligence operation around him, and he questioned whether it could bring the information to him in time, the way the old setup had done. King was having none of it. The Rochefort transfer stood, and Nimitz was told, not particularly gently, to mind his own business. There was even more to it, which they took up at this meeting. Army and Navy intelligence units would be combined if such were possible, King said. And in the discussion it came out that when this horde of intelligence people had begun to descend on Pearl Harbor, Nimitz had turned some of them over to Admiral Towers, the air commander. King was very disapproving. He regarded this act as the wrong kind of decentralization. Nimitz asked for submarines from the Atlantic waters, and King told him he could not have them. He asked for airplanes for the South Pacific, and King said he would take up the matter in Washington. Next day, they did more planning for the Aleutians operation. Nimitz again brought up the matter of Fitch's promotion, and King grunted that he would look into it. His mind, closed the day before, was open, he said. They began talking about strategy and movement into the Central Pacific, perhaps through the Marshall Islands. They talked about the Marianas. Nimitz was pleased to learn that King was thinking in terms of giving the Pacific War a given percentage of American war supplies and people, somewhere between 20 and 35%. Compared to the earliest days, when Nimitz was told to hold with what he had, This was remarkable improvement. They talked about the future of the South Pacific campaign that day. First stabilize Guadalcanal, then move to Buenfaisi, then to Rabaul. They were assuming that MacArthur would soon move into New Guinea and the Papuan Peninsula. This conference demonstrated the relationship between King and Nimitz, and something of the character of each. King was perhaps the most strong-minded man in the navy of his day, and that can be understood to mean stubborn as well as opinionated. He was a highly trained, thoughtful, and ingenious naval officer, noted for his cold, tough attitude at all times. He was also stern and unforgiving, but these particular qualities, to be exhibited later in relations with the Pacific Command, had not led to the Rochefort matter. King's reasoning was obviously of another sort. He was not going to have little kingdoms and little arguments impinge upon the war effort, and if he had to take a man who was doing an excellent job, even an irreplaceable man, and change him around, he would do so for the overall good of the service. Whether Rochefort was right or wrong in his quarrel with others was unimportant at that moment. What was important was that the quarrel was fraying the nerves of too many people in the intelligence service and in the places of high command. It was taking too much time and too much effort, and it must be stopped. Nimitz's reaction showed the controlled nature of the commander of the Pacific Fleet. He spoke forthrightly and even with an edge in his voice when he complained about what was being done within his command without his knowledge. But when King said loudly and clearly that it was being done and would be done, then Nimitz simply put the matter from his mind, showed King that he had done so, and did not let the matter affect any other aspect of their relationship. It was a remarkable performance, one that could not be accomplished by many men. King's control of the American naval effort was complete and sure, and the forcefulness of his responses lent strength to his commanders, who could be sure of their own power in their own spheres. Never did Nimitz question a King decision in any conversation or any letter to a subordinate. Sometimes his officers pressed him to right some grave injustice or to stop the operation of some plan they found wanting, but Nimitz's complete answer to them was that they had orders from higher authority, which meant King and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and above, and there was no questioning. What his officers may or may not have known is that if Nimitz shared their worries, he would already have exhausted every reasonable line of argument in his talks or messages to King, and that Nimitz knew precisely the length to which he could go without beginning the erosion of confidence that would eventually lead to Nimitz's own replacement and self-defeat. Both men had the faculty of going from some knotty problem with personality overtones that might wreck a relationship to nuts and bolts, and then ranging the whole field of the war. They discussed bases, anti-aircraft, and the torpedo situation. South Pacific Victory King remarked that he was not at all satisfied with the Navy supply system. It simply was not properly organized, he said, and he wanted to look into the Army system. They talked about ships, the old battleships in particular, how to modernize them and how to use them in this war. They discussed the Savo Island battle and the loss of the Wasp. King regarded both as unfinished business. He wanted to know who was responsible for the Savo Island disaster, and if there was fault in the operation of the Wasp. Earlier, Admiral Towers had begun a campaign to secure the appointment of aviators as task force commanders, where carriers were involved. Nimitz and King now agreed that a task force commander did not necessarily have to be an aviator, and furthermore, it was not Towers's business to raise the point. It was agreed that in future amphibious campaigns the Marines would be the shock troops, and that eventually Nimitz would have 4 divisions of Marines. As for Army units, Nimitz was to feel free to move units around without consulting King at every turn. All he had to do was explain, so King could explain to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On the last day they recapitulated and looked ahead. They considered moving through the Marshalls or taking Truk. King said that anything would be better than making a frontal attack on the Malay barrier. Eventually, they agreed, they would go up the China coast to strike Japan. No decisions were made about the future, but King was sure of one thing: they must not nibble around the edges. In the South Pacific, on December 9th, the 1st Marine Division was relieved and sent to Brisbane for rest and recuperation. To replace them, General MacArthur diverted to Halsey the Army's 25th Infantry Division. Nimitz knew, and he reported to Halsey, that he was getting, excluding the Marines, the best division west of the Mississippi. Nimitz was also very high on Major General Joseph Lawton Collins, commander of the division. He has brought his division to a high peak of efficiency and has imbued them with a will to kill Japanese. So the 1st Marines went to Brisbane. It turned out to be a sort of horror story through a comedy of errors and misinformation. When looking for a place to rest his Marines, Vandergrift had gone to Brisbane, where MacArthur kept his headquarters. The outlying area of Brisbane itself had been suggested, because it was high on the Australian continent, and the Marines could be deployed back into action quickly if they were needed. It was assumed that Brisbane would be satisfactory in all respects. Vandergrift went to the trouble to inquire about health problems, and there did not seem to be any. The 1st Marines had scarcely arrived at Brisbane, however, when their medical officers discovered they were moved from one malarial area to another. The camp was swarming with Anopheles mosquitoes, which the Marines were trying to escape, and the luckless leathernecks were infecting one another all over again. Vandergrift felt that he had been betrayed. He went scouting and discovered that Melbourne, on the southeast coast, was temperate and comfortable. It was also far more civilized and full of girls, motion picture houses, and even had a zoo. Vandergrift tried to get in touch with MacArthur, the supreme commander of the area, to secure a change. He did not get very far. After pussyfooting for some time, Vandergrift wrote to Halsey about the problem, and then was in touch with Colonel B.M. Fitch, MacArthur's adjutant general, asking that his men be moved south. On January 1st, Vandergrift received a reply to his request. Colonel Fitch wrote him, "The Commander-in-Chief directs I advise you as follows. His recommendations regarding location of Marine Division in Melbourne are approved. This approval is given because of the interjection into the situation of Admirals King and Halsey, which might indicate some inhibition with reference to the Marine Division, which is not known to the Commander-in-Chief, and upon General Vandergrift's strong recommendation, although based upon divided medical opinion and despite his personal discussion with the Commander-in-Chief of the tactical and strategic inadvisability of such action. No transportation facilities are available in the Southwest Pacific area to effect the move, which will have to be carried out by shipping made available from the South Pacific area. General Vandergrift is authorized to communicate directly with naval authorities to make the necessary arrangements. The already overburdened railroad facilities of Australia cannot cope with such a movement without jeopardizing operations upon which our forces are now engaged. So there it was. MacArthur would let the 1st Marine Division move, but Vandergrift would have to get Halsey to move him. Vandergrift was chagrined and embarrassed, but he approached Halsey and laid it out for him. Halsey swore, as was his fashion, and made uncomplimentary noises about army generals, but he supplied the transports, and the 1st Marines went south. Halsey could be brash, and sometimes Nimitz had to hold him in check. Nimitz had argued the case of task force commanders, securing Washington's permission specifically to choose any officers he wished to command task forces. Halsey was short of aggressive admirals and captains. "We are almost continuously under pressure here for want of rear admirals and senior captains in the pool." He chose Rear Admiral C.P. Mason, an aviator, to command a task force, which included Rear Admiral Harry Hill. Since Hill was senior to Mason, some eyebrows were raised, including those of Nimitz. He wrote Halsey, "I have approved your placing Mason in command of a task force which has a senior Hill in it, but I desire to control the use of this authority in accordance with Seknav's letter of July 18, 1942. I am sure you agree with me that there are many line officers thoroughly capable of taking command of a task force which has in it aircraft carriers, and that nothing would be more harmful to the morale of our senior officers than to create the impression that only aviators may command task forces, which have carriers included." Early in January, while the Tokyo Express was still running, it was apparent that Guadalcanal was under control. On January 10th, destroyers carrying supplies for the beleaguered Japanese moved down onto Savo Island, where they were intercepted by PT boats. A few days earlier they had sent down 8 destroyers, and the PT boats got one of them and kept them from landing supplies. This night, 2 PT boats were lost, but the enemy supply mission was harried, and that was the object. With such control, Nimitz could begin casting his eyes ahead without much worry. On January 10th, he and his staff at Pearl Harbor decided it would be a good idea to meet with General MacArthur to consult on the next steps the Navy would take, in conjunction with MacArthur's efforts. Nimitz offered to meet MacArthur in Noumea on January 17th, a date he chose because Secretary Knox was coming to Pearl Harbor on January 12th. If MacArthur bridled at going to Noumea, Nimitz was willing to pick up Halsey and take him to Brisbane to meet on MacArthur's ground. Nimitz made the offer. MacArthur replied that he was awaiting word from the Joint Chiefs of Staff with reference to the overall plan. He did not want to talk operations at this point. MacArthur was obviously very chary of any dealings with Nimitz or the Navy, and not without reason. Halsey had growled about the limitation on his activities at the 159th meridian, and Nimitz had told him not to worry. Already the Navy had invaded the general's assigned territory, and he wanted to be sure it did not happen again. At this same time, Halsey was fretting. "I have been seriously toying with the idea of a carrier-plus bombardment strike at Rabaul," he wrote Nimitz. "It is very tempting. The only thing that holds me back is my lack of knowledge of Phase 2, the second stage of the Solomons operation. I imagine that when that takes place, we are going to need all the combatant ships that we can lay out hands on." Halsey had many problems. He was establishing an offensive force of destroyers, the first purely offensive force of its kind in this war. He was trying to follow Nimitz's directive and bring the New Zealanders more into the war. New Zealand was part of his responsibility. Australia was MacArthur's. Early in January, Halsey was in Auckland, making a visit of state, so to speak. He comported himself very well and was immediately a popular figure. He got on well with the New Zealanders and seemed to be making progress in the difficult job of integrating New Zealand fighting men into his command. He was having more trouble integrating the constant flow of very important people who wanted to go out and have a 10-minute war. "Please stop the flow of Washington experts and sightseers to this area," he wrote Nimitz. "Each expert means £200 less of mail. I'll trade an expert for £200 of mail any time. The straw that is about to break the camel's back are the 3 members of the Economic War Board of Economic Warfare, who arrived yesterday. I cannot imagine a more useless outfit. I am thinking about inducting them into the service, putting them in uniform, sending them to Cactus. Let them do a little stevedore work, they won't be fit for fighting, and after teaching them something about the war, then send them home to economize." After the Gormley affair, Nimitz realized that he must keep close watch on so important a command as the South Pacific, which was actually his major fighting front. He had decided to keep one of his senior staff officers in the South Pacific at all times, and to make an inspection trip to the area himself at least once every 3 months. In the interim, Captain Redman had been down south organizing communications, and Admiral Calhoun had been there, energetically helping Halsey set up the supply system for the future. On January 23rd, Nimitz was in Noumea with 2 members of his staff, meeting with Halsey: Marine Brigadier General DeWitt Peck, Halsey's War Plans Officer, Captain Browning, Halsey's Chief of Staff, and Rear Admiral McCain, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, who had flown out from Washington. Nimitz began briskly with that wonderful way of his, in a few words outlining what the conference was going to cover and, equally important, what the conference was not going to cover. "The object of this conference is to review the situation in the South Pacific and to exchange views," he said. "No decision will be reached. Indeed, we may not agree on all points." Then he led them into it. First, as to Guadalcanal, what is Comsopac's, Halsey's view as to progress, approximate date Japanese will be eliminated? Shall we need more troops? What number should be left as a garrison on completion of the operation? General Peck suggested a target date of April 1st. The 2nd Marine Division could be withdrawn, and the Army forces could take over, 2 divisions plus service troops. Peck estimated there were 8,000 Japanese still on the island, with 4,000 of them effective as fighting troops. He and Halsey did not expect the Japanese to make a further effort to take Guadalcanal. "Peck has not been there for 2 weeks," said Halsey, indicating that there was some possibility of change in that situation. It was a great change from Nimitz's last visit, for then he found that Gormley and his people had not been there at all. Nimitz then sketched out the coming land operation by General Patch and his forces, and they discussed timing. They moved on. Nimitz: "What is Comsopac's ideas on future operations from Cactus Ringbolt, Guadalcanal to Lagi, at the end of February with what you have, or on April 1st when planes will increase in number?" McCain, chief of the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics, cautiously: "Promised increase in supply of planes." Nimitz: "Is the increase of planes proceeding?" Browning: "Yes, as regards Navy planes, not as regards Army planes." Nimitz, vigorously: "Will Comsopac originate a dispatch to Cominch, King Info SyncPac, requesting Army to carry out Army replacement and upkeep program?" McCain noted that he would raise this issue on his return, armed with the dispatch, which King would automatically hand over to him. McCain would actually get after the Army. At this point, Nimitz called for General Harmon, the senior Army officer in the command, and messengers were sent to bring him into the meeting. As they waited, they discussed minor operations, seizure of Russell Island, 80 miles from Guadalcanal, which would make a fighter field. General Patch's staff men discussed the coming ground operations in Guadalcanal, and Nimitz kept pressing for schedules and dates. "How will Cactus Guadalcanal be used next?" he asked. General Peck suggested as a supporting base. "But not a permanent one," said Nimitz. "Everything should be based on a forward movement." When General Harmon arrived, Nimitz restated the purpose of the meeting. "It is our understanding that the Army is behind in fulfilling its plane requirements," Nimitz said. Harmon agreed. Nimitz asked for a copy of the Army plans, and Harmon promised to get it for him. He then told the conference that when the Japanese were eliminated from Guadalcanal, they could begin work on Phase 2. He proposed that Halsey retain command of operations in the Solomons, even though he might impinge on MacArthur's geography, and asked if there were objections. General Harmon did not object, and neither did anyone else. So the plans were to proceed. This visit to the South Pacific included Secretary Knox, who was making his first trip out since the hurried flight to Pearl Harbor on the heels of the Japanese attack. Knox came to Pearl Harbor, along with Adlai Stevenson, his administrative assistant, and 2 other aides. The big flying boat was loaded down with steaks and china and silver, so the entourage would not suffer from the rigors of the South Pacific. But they suffered nonetheless. The old Jinx was along, was he not? The plane took off and was just circling the cane fields outside Pearl Harbor when pilot McLeod announced that 2 engines had gone dead, and he proposed to make either a dead-stick landing on the water or a crash landing in the cane fields after dumping the gas. Which did the Admiral want? Nimitz opted for the dead-stick landing, and the pilot brought the plane down. But a hole was torn in the bottom, and the flying boat began to sink. The party began moving up the hatch. Secretary Knox, who was broad in the bottom, got stuck, and the people below had to push him through. Then the others clambered out, in order of rank. They moved onto the wing and floated until Admiral Towers sent boats out from Ford Island to rescue them. Towers found a PB-4Y for the party, and in a little over an hour they were off again, heading for Midway. Several hours out, Nimitz took off his cap for the first time and asked his aide to look at his head. Lieutenant Commander Lamar was aghast. The snow-white hair was blotched and stuck with black blood. Nimitz had suffered a cut about 1.5 inches long on his scalp. Lamar found the medical kit. He did not want to put straight iodine on the Admiral's cut, so he diluted it with water, not knowing that iodine and water did not mix very well. Nimitz nearly hit the roof. On they went. At Midway they were greeted and dined by the officers of the command. While they were eating, their plane was refueled, and Nimitz's Jinx worked overtime. The fueling boat collided with the plane and tore a hole in a pontoon. They could not take off for another day. "The next 24 hours were literally hell," said Lieutenant Commander Lamar. "Midway Island was too small to contain the Secretary of the Navy and the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Ocean areas, both helpless and unable to get off the island. Even the goony birds ceased to be amusing after a few hours." On the trip, Adlai Stevenson was initiated into the ancient order of shellbacks of the Kingdom of Neptune by being fed a cocktail whose principal ingredient seemed to be fuel oil. Stevenson spent the remainder of that day quietly but devastatingly sick. They visited Fitch's headquarters at Espiritu Santo Noumea and then Guadalcanal Island. On Guadalcanal, it was almost as if the Japanese knew they were coming, for their housing area was bombed sporadically from 20:30 in the evening until morning. Halsey, along with Knox and McCain, dived for cover, but Nimitz said he was more afraid of mosquitoes than bombs, and slept in the hut in a mosquito bar. Knox had a real taste of the new spirit that was developing in the South Pacific, and he told a story that symbolized it when he returned. One day, 2 enlisted men were walking along the deck of the Argonne, talking about Halsey. "I'd go through hell for that old son of a bitch," said one of them. Just then, someone poked the sailor in the back. He turned. It was Halsey. "Young man," said the Admiral, "I'm not so old." Nor was he a son of a bitch, except perhaps in the eyes of the Japanese. Tokyo rose delighted in these days in listing the tortures that would be heaped upon Admiral Halsey when the Japanese captured him. There was reason for the Japanese annoyance. Halsey at the end of 1942 had made a New Year's prediction that the Americans would be in Tokyo before 1943 was out. He did not believe it, but he did not realize either what a symbol of the American fighting man he had become, or that his words would be taken as gospel back home. But with the victories in Guadalcanal, that is how it was. One day, Representative Melvin J. Mass of Minnesota wrote President Roosevelt a memorandum suggesting that Roosevelt discard MacArthur and put Halsey in charge of the whole war in the Pacific. On Halsey's recent trip to Auckland, he had given an interview to the press predicting Japanese retreat, and one newspaperman had summed up Halsey's public appeal. His confidence was clearly immense, but the expression of it was even and not in declamatory statements. It was so great and so obviously no bigger than his conviction that it was infectious, and as the statement succeeded, it became very clear why it was said of Admiral William Pudge Halsey by his officers and men that they would follow him to hell. He is a man whose confidence could clearly win battles. That confidence did not entirely account for Halsey's hold on his men. Another reason was his own intense loyalty to them. Months earlier, as we have seen, he had asked for a specific officer to discover that the officer was teaching ROTC at the University of North Carolina, and the Bureau of Personnel was loath to release him. The officer was Commander Oliver Owen Kessing, a graduate of the Academy's class of 1914 and an old friend of Halsey's. After much complaint to Nimitz and many ill-tempered exchanges with Admiral Horn, Kessing came to the South Pacific, where Halsey proposed to make him a base commander. But he came without a promotion. Halsey went to bat again with Nimitz. Kessing, despite my request, came out here as a commander. I do not know why he was passed over, nor do I care. I know him well, personally and officially. He is a fighting man. Peacetime and wartime standards have a small relationship. He will make good in any man's war, and this is every man's war. In order to further the war effort, in his dealings with the Army, Navy and Marines, he should be a captain. The fact that he is not a distinct handicap, I shall officially recommend him. If the Bupas still insist that peacetime standards are more important than furthering the war effort, I am hogtied. Come what may, unless I get orders from higher authority, I shall keep him in command of Ringbolt Tulagi. I consider him ideally suited for that job, which, in my estimation, is the most critical in this area for future operations. On this trip, Halsey again brought up scrappy Kessing. Nimitz said he had approved Halsey's request for the promotion. Halsey announced that if the promotion had not come through by the time they returned to Noumea, he was going to send Kessing a dispatch with a copy to Bupas. You will assume rank, uniform and title of Captain U.S. Navy. Chester had a fit, Halsey said. Nimitz pleaded, "No, for God's sakes, don't do it. You'll foul up everything." "You wait and see," said Halsey. When they returned to Noumea, Kessing's promotion had come through, and the incident was resolved. But again it had served to create impressions of Halsey. An impression that here was a commander of great loyalty to his men, which permeated the staff. An impression of a fighting admiral, which came across to Nimitz. An impression of an interfering revolutionary, which was very definitely in the dark thoughts of the bureaus of the Navy in Washington. An impression of hot-headedness that Secretary Knox took away with him. By the end of January, Halsey could put 5 task forces into action. So much had the situation of the ships improved. As Nimitz and his party headed back for Pearl Harbor, Halsey sent these forces into the waters around Guadalcanal to escort troops that were relieving the 2nd Marine Division at Guadalcanal. Task Force 18 was one of these groups of ships. It included 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 2 escort carriers carrying 29 fighters, 8 dive bombers, and 24 torpedo bombers, and 8 destroyers. The coming of the escort carriers indicated what was happening as America's war potential was translated into ships and planes and men. The escort carrier was developed partly as a result of British and American studies of the war in the Atlantic, where the German submarines operated in wolf packs and harried the supply forces and merchant shipping, sometimes beyond the ability of destroyers and corvettes to put up effective defense. As ships became more readily available with the huge growth of the American shipping industry in the war, it became possible to divert some merchant ship hulls to conversion to aircraft carriers. These carriers did not, of course, look anything like fleet carriers or light carriers. They did not have complete machine shops of that kind. They carried a relative handful of planes. But they could be built quickly, they had adequate flight decks for operations, and they could carry fighters and bombers into battle. A half-dozen escort carriers could bring a strong influence to bear, and by 1944 they were playing a role in Atlantic and in Pacific warfare in protection of shipping. In the Pacific, they would be used for a new job, the covering of invasion forces from the Japanese land-based air, thus supplementing their responsibility to protect invasion fronts. In this deployment of escort or jeep carriers, Halsey was rather hoping that Admiral Yamamoto would send down a major force. Yamamoto was in no position to do so. Already the Japanese were beginning to feel the hardening of their oil arteries, and Tokyo had interdicted Yamamoto from any major excursions. But the Tokyo Express was still running, beginning to evacuate Japanese soldiers from Guadalcanal, although the Americans were not yet aware of this change, and the Japanese still came in with determination on the sea and in the air. On the night of January 29th, Japanese torpedo bombers found Task Force 18 and attacked. At a cost of 3 Bettys, they put a torpedo into the heavy cruiser Chicago. She was taken in tow by Louisville that night, and all seemed well. But the next day, the Japanese planes were out again, and a dozen of them found the force. Planes from Enterprise shot down 3 of them, but the other 9 launched an attack on Chicago and the destroyer La Valette. 7 of the Bettys were shot down, but the 2 ships were hit, and Chicago sank. King was displeased. He was far more displeased with the general tenor of operations in the South Pacific. Because Halsey and Vandergrift, Patch and Harmon, Fitch and Lockwood and Christie had accomplished so much with so little, Washington found it hard to understand why the shortage of supplies was holding up the clearing out of Guadalcanal, or why anything was holding up this operation. King had already suggested that wait, delay, and linger were the watchwords of the South Pacific force. While Nimitz had been visiting the South Pacific, King was in North Africa attending the Casablanca Conference. There he had made the point that only 15% of all Allied war effort was being turned against the Japanese, and had suggested it was time for everyone to push harder in the Pacific. Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, had suggested that the Japanese were already on the defensive, which Halsey and Nimitz believed, but King did not. The other members of the combined chiefs of staff had wanted to talk about Europe, but King kept bringing the conversation back to the Pacific. If Japan was not to consolidate her gains, he said, more effort must be made. With his resources, he could do nothing more than hold. He pushed for the British to move in Burma, thus to put a new pressure on the Japanese in another area. King wanted to seize Truk and move into the Marianas. Keep moving was his philosophy. In the end, at Casablanca, the guidelines were laid down for the campaign in the Pacific until the defeat of Germany, which the President and Prime Minister hoped to accomplish in 1943. King's biographer summarizes, "Subject to this, and in addition to the maintenance of vital lines of communication and the continuance of submarine attacks against Japanese shipping, various operations in the Pacific were contemplated. These included an advance from Guadalcanal and New Guinea, leading to the capture of Rabaul, an advance westward in the Central Pacific toward Truk and the Marianas, a movement along the New Guinea-Mindanao axis as far as Timor, the establishment of the security of the Aleutian Islands, and steps toward the recapture of Burma." On February 2nd, King met with President Roosevelt and the others of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 2 days later he wrote Nimitz, complaining about the lack of progress in Guadalcanal. Kings seldom complain without offering specific remedies. In this instance he had several suggestions, which amounted to commands. First, Secretary Knox had been up to his usual snap judgments. Coming back from the South Pacific, Knox had decided that the failure lay in Halsey's inability to plan movements ahead. His solution? Replace Captain Browning as Chief of Staff with someone who knew more about the capabilities of certain ships, amphibious forces, etc. There was much more to it than that. Browning had obviously antagonized Secretary Knox, just as he had sometimes antagonized King himself. Browning did have a sharp tongue, Halsey admitted, but the saturnine and hard-living Browning also was a master tactician. He was given credit for choosing the moment of strike against the Japanese at Midway, which resulted in the Japanese carriers being caught rearming their planes, and was a major factor in the stunning defeat administered by Spruance. It was no less Spruance's victory for all that. A commander takes the risks and the rap for any advice from staff members. But Spruance had nothing but praise for Browning's capabilities, as did Halsey. For both commanders, Browning's brains more than compensated for any personality deficiencies. Still, such are the fortunes of the military. Even in wartime, careers were made and wrecked by a snarl or the absence of a pleasant smile. Browning was to be replaced. The second point, one of King's own, was that Fitch would need some help in planning and managing air bases in the Pacific as they moved along. King wanted to bring Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd into that position. "I suggest Dick Byrd for this job because he is a driver. But more than that, he has a vast fund of experience in planning and carrying out expeditions, as well as a very considerable first-hand knowledge of naval aviation." Byrd had already made a survey of islands suitable for air bases on behalf of the Bureau of Aeronautics, visiting Palmyra, Tutuila, Upolu, Wallis, Tongatabu, Efate, Noumea, and Bora Bora. King also requested a progress report on the Solomons campaign. "I am still unhappy about the lack of progress," he said, "and would like to hear from you, and from Halsey, some definite plan for getting on with the job. At present, as for some months past, it seems to me that we merely continue to swap punches with the enemy, to our advantage, to be sure, but without working to any plan that is apparent here." King was irritated by MacArthur's continued failure to state what his plans, not views, are. He wanted the ideas of Nimitz and Halsey as to what they would do if they were given a free hand in the Solomons. Nimitz had known precisely how to handle the Army's failure to supply its airplane requirements when he had asked Halsey to send a hot message to King. On his return from Africa, King had found the message, and McCain had not had to do anything. King had taken the Army's failure up with General Marshall's post-haste. He did not think there would be any more trouble, he told Nimitz. He also said, with some pride, that the U.S. Chiefs of Staff insisted on recognition of the fact that there is a war going on in the Pacific, and that it had to be adequately implemented, even though the major part continues to be in the European theatre. 4 days later, Nimitz and Halsey gave King the answer they had been preparing for him for 4 months. The Japanese withdrew all the forces they could from Guadalcanal. There was the answer to King's charges of punch-swapping. February 9th, August 1943. Now that the enemy on Guadalcanal has been defeated, a decision must be made regarding our next moves, said the entry in Admiral Nimitz's daily war summary for February 9, 1943. Cominch, King, requests comments on an operation to seize, occupy and hold Gilbert and Ellis Islands. The war had taken a new turn. From the beginning, American submarines had been carrying out a bold and very successful fight against Japanese shipping. Until now, they were the only American weapon that could reach into Japanese-controlled waters, through which most of that shipping travelled. The blockade of Japan was beginning, and it would never let up. So effective was Admiral Lockwood's force that Nimitz literally could pay less attention to it than to any other aspect of his war effort. At this time it began to appear that sufficient resources would be available to continue the offensive in the Solomons and New Guinea area, and also to open up a front in the Central Pacific. Spruance and Nimitz looked at the Central Pacific. They wanted to take control of that great area, which lay west of longitude 180 degrees and north of latitude 5 degrees south. The area was controlled by the Japanese fleet, based on Truk in the Carolines. That is why Nimitz referred to Truk as the Japanese cojones, and why he often talked of the day when his flag would fly above that base in a way that indicated he felt the occupation of Truk would be his greatest accomplishment to that date. Truk was connected to Japan by a series of air bases located strategically on islands throughout the area. Japan to the Bonins, to the Marianas, to Truk, and then out east and west mutually supporting, and the air pipeline extended all the way back to Japan. Reinforcements of all kinds of planes could be flown down to Truk, a very great advantage the Japanese held at this point in the war. But that was longer-range planning than King was requesting at this very moment, and Nimitz knew it. Nimitz was looking toward the Aleutians, hoping to move quickly to clean out the nest of Japanese who had moved in there at the time of the Midway battle. With the change in command from Theobald to Kinkaid in the north, all the old difficulties that had bothered Theobald seemed to have evaporated. Perhaps both Army and Navy had learned to be a bit more forbearing with one another. In any event, Admiral Fletcher had made an inspection trip to Alaska, and he returned to Seattle to report to Nimitz that all was well. The Army people were learning to bomb at low level, and to operate under difficult conditions. Nimitz confided his thinking to Kinkaid. He and his staff were considering a push toward Paramushiro and the Kurils. What he really wanted, however, was an estimate from Kinkaid about the difficulties of taking Kiska. Late in February, Nimitz flew to San Francisco again to meet with King. This meeting marked a major change in the discussions between these two admirals. Before, the problems had been immediate, demanding answers and action. Now the two sat down to plan for a long and complicated war. The major items for discussion involved logistics. There was the matter of dredges needed for Midway. When one is engaged in a life-or-death struggle for islands that control a continent, dredges do not seem very important. But Midway needed dredging, and the Pacific Fleet needed Midway as a staging area for ships and submarines on the offensive. There was the matter of airplanes. Captain Ofsty, Nimitz's air officer, was to go to Washington to confer with McCain and the Joint Chiefs on air matters. Airplanes were beginning to come through for the Pacific, and it took some new bookkeeping to keep track of them. There would be reports from Washington about the number of airplanes sent. There would be reports from Halsey and other headquarters on the number of planes actually received, for some ships might be torpedoed, and some might deliver their cargoes to the wrong places. The war was becoming complicated, and more controls were being devised. Much as Nimitz hated to consider the idea of increasing his staff, he was forced to do so. The old figure of 32 had long since been given the deep 6. There were 48 senior staff members now, plus 30 young officers attached to SINCPAC for training in communications, 7 on bathythermograph duty, and 4 on the operations plotting board. It was still a small staff, but how much longer it could continue was debatable. At this meeting there was talk of setting up a whole new section to deal with technical matters and analysis, but it kept coming back to logistics, an aircraft assembly plant for Bora Bora, joint information centres for the ports, basic logistic plans for theatres involved in joint Army-Navy operations, Army services of supply officers for Navy service forces. Should there be 1 620-ton destroyers or 2 100-ton destroyers for the Pacific? 6 months before any destroyers would have been welcome. A Fleet Inspector General? As for Henry Kaiser's ships, 8 of them were in various ports with cracks in their hulls, and 1 tanker had broken in 2 at dockside. What was to be done? A floating battleship dry dock for the South Pacific? Where? For some time, Nimitz and Halsey and King had been troubled by the demands of correspondents to cover the war and the provision of transportation and press facilities for them. Actually, none of these commanders really liked having the press about. Nimitz and King agreed here that Admiral Jacobs would conduct a survey looking toward reduction of photographic, public relations, and intelligence personnel wherever possible. The press simply was not going to be allowed to be a nuisance in the war effort. Although radio intelligence had been very valuable already, sometimes the intelligence men seemed to disturb Nimitz and the others. In the early days of the war, before Midway, Captain E.M. Zacharias had been in Pearl as commander of a cruiser, and he had spent several hours telling Admiral Dremel of the dangers of an uprising of people of Japanese ancestry in the islands. Dremel had come away from the encounter with the feeling of clutching a ghost, a feeling that many line officers shared when confronted by specialists in intelligence. It was not all logistics and annoyances, however. King laid out the war plan for 1943. Limited operations was the term for it, protection of the Allied lines of communications, while attacks were made on the Japanese. The American submarines were already proving to be a formidable weapon against Japan, and were whittling very satisfactorily at the long Japanese supply lines. But there must be more action. Halsey would carry it. In the absence of any concrete statements from MacArthur, King said that Halsey would have to continue to work his way up the Solomons, for political reasons, if none other. The test would be, the operation should cut the Japanese supply lines while protecting our own. In one way, the American position was reversed, and not favourably. Earlier the Japanese had air superiority, but in the Solomons campaign the Americans had attained air superiority on a defensive basis. The haul for the Japanese to attack was a long one, but now the haul for the Americans to attack the Japanese bases would be a long one, and would temporarily preclude the use of torpedo planes and dive bombers against their shipping. It would be unwise, said King, to bypass their land-based air positions until their air strength had been whittled down considerably. Airfields at Tarawa, a seaplane base at Makin, a succession of airfields in the Marshalls, fields and seaplane bases at Yaluit, Maloelap, Voce, all these demanded attention before the advance could be carried on. So the action was to be attrition, while concentrating on building up American air strength, pushing the army into meeting its commitments and building air bases. King, of course, wanted action, which meant the seizure of territory. But Nimitz argued against frittering away American strength in seizing territories, which he might not be able to hold. They agreed that the Japanese fleet was, at that moment, still stronger than anything the Americans could put together to oppose it. Nimitz argued for caution. The new Essex-class carriers were on the ways, but it would be months before they were ready for action. In the meantime, the Japanese had this strong interior air supply line by which they could ferry planes and equipment through the islands from Japan to the South Pacific without use of ships, while the Americans simply had to depend on shipping. Nimitz was in favor of attrition, knocking out all the Japanese planes possible, and waiting until the fleet strength could be ready with the fleet air power that was needed. The move at this point, said Nimitz, was to be economical in the use of American forces, concentrating on attack by submarines and aircraft against Japanese shipping. He would undertake any operation that had a reasonable prospect of success, and whose failure would not be disastrous, but he did not want to go too far. Here was the slogan hung by his desk again. King argued back. It was a question of initiative. The Americans had it, they must keep it, even take very considerable calculated risks to retain that initiative. Otherwise, Nimitz might find himself in a position where he would be ordered, by the political leaders, to undertake operations that might not be sound. Nimitz must not forget either, said the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, that King had been through considerable difficulty in obtaining allocation of more forces for the Pacific at this time. They must be used, or he could not justify asking again at the combined Chiefs of Staff meetings. In other words, Nimitz had to honour the promissory notes King had given at Casablanca if King was to be able to help Nimitz further in the matter of supplies and men. Nimitz said Japan would never give up just because her fleet might be decimated. King agreed, and added that China must be kept in the war, if for no other reason than to provide necessary bases for the later stages of the campaign against Japan. Operations would eventually move to the China coast, the admirals agreed. The meeting on February 23rd was devoted to review of the military situation in the South Pacific. Nimitz noted that he now had about 250,000 men in the area. A move would be made, using the Samoa-Fiji-New Caledonia line as the basis for operations. Now began a period of building and consolidating. Halsey was hard at it. In spite of Secretary Knox's low estimate of Halsey's abilities as commander, as opposed to fighter, Halsey saw precisely what had to be done, and began to do it. The problem was to get the ships a place to come to bring them in, to get them unloaded in the right places, turned around and out of the South Pacific. Halsey had asked Nimitz for more destroyers, but there were no more destroyers. Nimitz had suggested that Halsey let the ships move about in the area without escort. Halsey refused, even though the days when Iron Bottom Sound seemed to be a Japanese lake had ended. I do not feel justified in sending ships into the Cactus Ringbolt area, particularly troop ships, without an escort, Halsey told his chief. The supply and logistics problems were extremely complicated, even here, because the Navy was not geared to a long-line logistics approach. In order to help things along, Nimitz had sent Admiral Calhoun down to Halsey numerous times, and Calhoun had established a service squadron, Serv-on-Sopak. But in the tactical area, logistics were the responsibility of Admiral Turner, the amphibious force commander, and that specifically meant Tulagi and Guadalcanal, where bases had to be built up. Thus there were two commands involved. Nimitz had suggested that the whole supply organization be put under Rear Admiral Cobb, the service squadron commander. Halsey had both commanders working separately for him, and they liked it. For example, when ships arrived at Noumea consigned to the Navy, Cobb worked out the details of unloading with the Army, for the Army had charge of unloading at Noumea. General Williamson, the Army base commander, had Army, Navy, Marine, and native labourers as stevedores, working on a 16-hour basis, with no distinctions among them. On arrival at shore, the Navy hauled off its own supplies, the Army did likewise, and so did the Marines, and put them in their own dumps. Warehouses were being built. In the meantime, Captain Nick Carter, the Advanced Bases supply man, was free to travel around to various bases and worry about their special problems. He was directly subordinate to Halsey, and Halsey felt it ought to stay that way. So did Carter. So did Cobb. Supply in the forward areas was also difficult and complicated because it involved Army, Navy, and Marines. Cobb would allocate vessels to all forward areas except Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The commanding general, Army, on Guadalcanal, would submit a requisition for all the forces there and in Tulagi, and these would go to the commanding general of the Services of Supply, Army, who parcelled them out to the various services. The stores were then allocated and assembled on ships moving forward. Kelly Turner would appoint a convoy commander, and the ships would move out. The commanding general on Guadalcanal would then supervise the unloading. Halsey wanted to keep the organization that way. However, he said, I am not bull-headed, at least I do not think I am, and I am perfectly willing to change at any time. Soon enough, he would have to change. During all these months when Nimitz had been directing the war in the Central and South Pacific, General MacArthur had been fighting in the Southwest Pacific. After Bataan, MacArthur had been completely on the defensive for several months. The Japanese had cleaned up the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. They had moved into Timor and Ceram, and then Dutch New Guinea. They had moved into Lae and Salamaua. In May 1942, they had started to invade Port Moresby. This was the invasion stopped by the equivocal victory of the Americans at the Battle of the Coral Sea. All this time, MacArthur was getting practically nothing from America. The forces allocated to the Pacific went to Nimitz to fight the Battle of the Solomons. In the autumn of 1942, when Vice Admiral Arthur Carpenter had relieved Leary, MacArthur's naval forces consisted of 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers, 20 submarines, and 7 smaller craft. The once proud, though small, Asiatic fleet of the United States had been practically wiped out in the battles of the Philippines and the East Indies. Admiral Thomas C. Hart had come home. What was left of the fleet had been put in the hands of a Dutch admiral, and that was soon dissipated. The first offensive action had been the capture of Milne Bay, New Guinea, using Australian and American troops and Australian and American naval forces. The Japanese had tried to take Milne Bay, launching an amphibious operation, but the Australians and the Americans had fought them off. General MacArthur then set out to push the Japanese out of Papua. After months of almost unbelievable jungle fighting in mountains and swamps, the Australians and the Americans concluded the Papuan campaign just 2 weeks before Guadalcanal fell. The Japanese then decided to reinforce Lae with a convoy and naval forces from Rabaul. 8 transports and 8 destroyers set out. They sailed at midnight on the last day of February. On March 2nd, B-17S of General Kenny's command caught the convoy north of Cape Gloucester and sank 1 transport. The B-17S came in at medium altitude, and the Japanese ignored them. But then along came several flights of A-20S and B-25S medium bombers, whose pilots had trained for low-level attack by skip bombing. They moved in and devastated the convoy. Most of the ships were stopped or sunk. 4 undamaged destroyers rescued survivors as they saw them, and fled north to escape the Allied planes. Then, on March 3rd, the PT boats found the Japanese. Together, PT boats and bombers did away with 12 of the 16 ships of the convoy. Only those 4 destroyers escaped. This Battle of the Bismarck Sea set the stage. A new offensive and a plan were wanted, within the framework of the 15 to 20% of men and material that the combined chiefs had estimated they could spare to the Pacific during 1943. What was needed was more correlation of effort between MacArthur and Nimitz's commands. In March, the efforts began. On March 7th, Miles Browning and other staff officers from Halsey's South Pacific Force went to Pearl Harbor, where they met with MacArthur's representatives. Halsey wanted to move against Munda in April. MacArthur proposed to move against the Huon Gulf and suggested that Halsey delay until May. Nimitz agreed with Halsey, and since the argument could not be settled, the Halsey men and the MacArthur men went to Washington, accompanied by Admiral Spruance and Captain Ernest G. Small, Nimitz's war plans officer. They would take their cases before the Joint Chiefs of Staff. One point was that MacArthur had always felt the Solomons fell within his bailiwick, but now the Navy had so built up the area that it had a vested interest. The Joint Chiefs decided that Halsey should wait until MacArthur moved. Furthermore, they issued a directive throwing commands into a very difficult situation. MacArthur would be in charge of the next operations. Halsey would be in charge of the Solomons campaign, but he would be responsible to MacArthur, except that any ships, planes and ground forces of the Pacific Fleet that were not specifically assigned to the operations under MacArthur by the Joint Chiefs would remain under Nimitz. There, obviously, was a formula under which a minor tactical defeat could be turned into a strategic disaster by a failure in communications or a clash of egos. What was needed was total cooperation between the commands. In the past, Halsey had been extremely critical of MacArthur. Not the least of this attitude had stemmed from MacArthur's highly developed sense of public relations. He gave newsmen very thorough access to the facts of the war. Having such material available, the correspondents wrote many stories about the MacArthur Command, and its activities were dominating the newspapers. The Navy's sense of public relations was embryonic. Traditionally, the Navy liked to mind its own business. In the case of the Pacific Fleet and the Navy at large, there was another indefinable factor. During the Spanish-American War, which came during the formative years of most of the men who were admirals in World War II, Rear Admiral William T. Sampson had been assigned to blockade the Spanish along the northern shore of Cuba. Commodore Winfield Scott Schley had been assigned the southern coast. Sampson had set out at once to hunt for the Spanish, Schley had delayed, and the Spanish fleet had gotten by him and into Santiago de Cuba, where it lay under the protective guns of land batteries. Admiral Sampson had arrived off Santiago de Cuba on June 1st and assumed command of the blockade, since he was the senior officer present. There was a certain friction between the two men and their adherents because of the manner in which the Spanish fleet had made its flight to safety. Admiral Cervera, the Spanish commander, was under orders from his king to fight to the death, and on the morning of July 3, 1898, he brought his little fleet of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers out of Santiago harbour. At that moment, Admiral Sampson was absent, and Commodore Schley took tactical command. Sampson rushed back to the scene, but by the time he got there, the battle was virtually history. The Spanish naval might was destroyed. Then came a dingy page in American naval history. The two commanders began to quarrel about the honour of the victory. The quarrel lasted until their deaths and divided the naval service. Many hot arguments were waged, and many friendships destroyed by adherence to one or the other of these men. King, Nimitz, Halsey, all the senior admirals, could remember this disgraceful period only too well. They blamed the press by and large for keeping the struggle alive. Nimitz had vowed that if ever I reached a position of high command, I would do my best to stifle any such family controversies before they reached the attention of the public. But more than that, Nimitz, like King, Richardson, Bloch, and others, had become exceedingly shy of publicity. One reason for the Sampson-Schley controversy to have become as important as it did was the taking of sides by various members of a new breed, the war correspondents. Greatest of all these was Richard Harding Davis, but the war correspondents of the Spanish-American War were all romanticized figures, and their words carried much weight. In World War I, the Americans entered late, and the Navy's work was largely unromantic. World War II brought an entirely different picture, and yet the Navy was not attuned to the changes. The American press had been too well informed for too long to accept censorship without a struggle. The Navy had a very good argument. Fleet operations must be treated with far more secrecy than land military operations. Take a simple case of identification, which proved all-important. The Japanese believed that they had sunk Yorktown in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Had they known the truth, Admiral Yamamoto's planning for Midway might have taken quite a different turn, and the whole balance of the battle might have been changed. The Japanese did not know the truth about the Yorktown because naval censorship concealed the facts about the movements of ships and damages. In other cases, the Japanese might think they had sunk a cruiser when actually they had sunk a destroyer, and the difference in fleet power was very great indeed. Such was the legitimate argument for special public relations practices in the Navy that differed from those of the Army. But censorship can also be used to cloak idiocies. Furthermore, the people at home in the United States were vitally concerned with the progress of the war. Their production efforts depended on their morale, and this effect of the military upon the civilians was a factor the Navy Professional Officer Corps was not yet ready to appreciate. America had never been involved in an all-out war before. When Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet, he inherited his public relations officer, Lieutenant Commander Waldo Drake of the Naval Reserve, who had been shipping editor of the Los Angeles Times. Drake was a conscientious and extremely loyal man, inclined to hot temper and sometimes injudicious use of language, but he knew precisely how Nimitz wanted the press handled, and he did as he was told. In the beginning, a handful of newspaper correspondents was assigned to cover the war. Foster Haley came for the New York Times, James Kilgallen for International News Service, Keith Wheeler for the Chicago Times, Robert Casey for the Chicago Daily News, Robert Trumbull for the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, Frank Tremaine for United Press Associations, Jack Rice and Wendell Webb for Associated Press. Wheeler, for example, had flown out to Pearl Harbor by clipper with Haley and Kilgallen on Christmas Day, 1941. He had secured his press credentials and the Navy had let him interview a handful of flyers who had shot down some Japanese planes. The wreckage of the battleships was in plain view for all to see, but the correspondent's questions were not answered. A few days later, Wheeler, Rice, Robert Landry of Life, H.R. Knickerbocker of the Chicago Sun, Joseph C. Harsh of the Christian Science Monitor, and Casey went to sea with Task Force 8. They were to be involved in the first big Halsey raid. As the war progressed, more correspondents came to join the fleet. Waldo Drake was promoted to commander, and his assistant, Lieutenant James Bassett, was sent down to the South Pacific to work for Halsey. Guadalcanal brought a new flock of correspondents into action, and in those desperate early days the correspondents seemed to be a terrible nuisance. They wanted plane space. They wanted to get their stories out. Some of them, fresh from civilian life, complained about their foxholes and other accommodations, and sometimes the naval officers became furious with these complaints. But by and large, the difficulties came about because Halsey, Nimitz, King, and the others took the position that 200 pounds of mail was of more value to the fleet than 200 pounds of correspondent. With Japanese bombs raining overhead, it was easy to forget that back home the people needed to know, independently, how the war was going along, and they needed non-security details, which only writers and reporters could give them. The difficulties of public relations came to light in this period of lull. The New Zealand minister to the United States asked Nimitz for permission to stop off in Guadalcanal on his way home, and Nimitz granted it, informing Halsey. Halsey bleated, "I'm afraid I have been placed in a position that may well be embarrassing by your gang. When the fighting was still in progress in Guadalcanal, I refused permission for any civilians to go even to the button." Mr. Coates, a very fine gentleman, also a member of the New Zealand War Cabinet, requested authority in November to visit both Button and Guadalcanal. I turned him down. Your order for Mr. Nash, the New Zealand minister to the US, to be permitted to go to Guadalcanal will, of course, be carried out. However, it will give Mr. Coates a real reason for kicking if he chooses to make use of it. As a member of the New Zealand War Cabinet, he will naturally feel he has more right to visit his own flyers than has an accredited minister. Nimitz replied soothingly. Halsey had been quite right, he said, but matters had changed. As a matter of policy in dealing with New Zealand officials, I believe we should accord them as much opportunity as is practicable to visit the areas in which they have an interest. New Zealand has made, is making, and will continue to make a very vital effort to participate in the South Pacific War. Their willingness to participate has won them a very friendly feeling in Washington with our high military and naval authorities. Nimitz had another matter in mind that day. The fact was, he told Halsey confidentially, during my incumbency in my present job, I have been slowly but surely pushed into the position of lending all facilities to newsmen which will not prejudice operations, and of releasing factual material which is of no assistance to the enemy. In doing the above, he added, I have kept just one jump ahead of Colonel Knox, who has almost taken the matter out of my hands once or twice. And thus Nimitz announced a basic change in Pacific public relations policy, based on recommendations made by Waldo Drake, who had just returned from the South Pacific. Newsmen had been denied the use of the airplanes travelling between the South Pacific and almost anywhere. They travelled by surface ship, and sometimes their dispatches did too. Nimitz now told Halsey to give the newsmen rides on planes, and to send their press copy out by plane as well. He sent to the South Pacific Lieutenant, J.G., Frank Rounds, who would go with Fitch and thus handle news copy in the forward area. The matter had come to a head just then, because Robert C. Miller, a United Press correspondent, had written a hot article about press censorship in the South Pacific. Halsey's censor had refused to pass it and sent it along to Nimitz's staff. Nimitz was releasing it, without question, because I do not object to honest criticism. He suggested that Halsey read a copy of the article and note the complaints. While I do not propose countenance releases which will be of benefit to the enemy, I believe that we should do everything in our power to avoid getting bad press, which articles like Miller's will certainly bring about. And as for Drake's recommendations, Halsey had best carry them out quickly. The above suggested steps should be taken by you at once to obviate remedial directives from Colonel Knox. Another cloud on the horizon was an inter-service rivalry that threatened to become serious. In the first year of the war, it had become crystal clear that the most spectacular weapons against Japan were submarines and airplanes. As far as submarines were concerned, there was no difficulty. The silent service had proved itself long since. In Nimitz's early days, officers were assigned to the submarine service willy-nilly, but no longer. It was a volunteer service now, a highly honoured branch of the Navy. Captain Christie had recently flown up to Rear Admiral and was commanding the submarines of the Southwest Pacific, for Rear Admiral Lockwood had just moved to Pearl Harbor to become a Vice Admiral and commander of submarines in the Pacific Fleet, on the death in an airplane crash of Admiral English. All three of these officers were professional submariners. The cloud that was growing darker concerned the air service. Where the submariners ran their own show and could claim that even Nimitz was one of them, the airmen were disconsolate because they wanted more seniority and more control of their own affairs. There was a big difference, however. A submarine operated alone or in a pack with other submarines. Airplanes operated from land bases or from carriers, and in the case of carriers, these highly vulnerable portable airfields demanded support from heavy ships, cruisers at least, and preferably fast battleships, anti-aircraft cruisers, and many, many destroyers to protect them from enemy submarines. That was the rub. The aviators contended that since the central core of the task force was the carrier, the task force should be commanded by an aviator. The line officers contended that an aviator might command a task force, but not solely because he was an aviator. Actually, aviators were line officers, but there was a difference between aviators and other line officers, a difference that had existed for many years. In the years before the war, the aviators had green flying uniforms and khaki uniforms, with black stripes on the sleeves to denote rank and brown shoes. Sometimes, also, they wore the line officers' blue uniforms with gold braid, or their resplendent whites with gold braid, and black shoes. After the war began, and in the southern seas it was a matter of wearing whites, it soon came to Admiral King's attention that whites were really not cut out for warfare. The officers in their white uniforms stood out starkly on the decks of the grey battleships at night. King then authorised that uniform, the grey, which was to be worn by all services, and also there were khakis and whites and blues. Neither Nimitz nor Halsey liked the greys. Some officers came into the fleet from stateside or from the Atlantic wearing the new uniforms, but they quickly stowed them in their sea bags or sent them home, and adopted the khaki that was universal in the Pacific. The difference then between the various services seemed to be diminished, but in fact the terms black shoe and brown shoe now developed. The aviators had been wearing brown shoes with their greens and khakis. The line officers wore black shoes with their blues and whites. The aviators kept their brown shoes and the line officers their black shoes. The shoes were only symbolic. What was important was the attack by the most fervent of the aviators against the very structure of naval command. The line officers feared that if the aviators had their way, then none but the airmen would succeed to major command in the future. And in the development of the war and of air power, the fear was growing month by month. The aviators chafed. Halsey, an aviator himself, was chafing during the lull in fighting, but for a different reason. To get things going again, he made a trip in April to Brisbane to see MacArthur, whom he had never met. 5 minutes after I reported, he said, I felt as if we were lifelong friends. MacArthur received Halsey in his office, rose from his bare desk and paced back and forth between desk and the wall, where hung a picture of George Washington. The general was 63, but Halsey said he did not look more than 50 years old. His hair was jet black, his eyes were clear and piercing, and he carried himself firmly erect. As they talked, MacArthur paced, poking the air with his corncob pipe and orating. Halsey was impressed and admitted it. His unkind thoughts of the past vanished, and were replaced by a deep respect for the general, which obviously facilitated the unlikely relationship between their commands. Halsey returned with agreement on their combined operations, which were to begin May 15th.